They called themselves men of honor, but their empire was built in blood, shadows, and silence. From ancient Japan to the streets of America, the Yakuza's hidden influence shaped politics, business, and crime as we know it. What if I told you their story didn't end? It evolved. Stay with us, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to discover about the Yakuza will change everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and fear. In the smoky aftermath of Japan's feudal collapse, when the proud samurai lost their swords, their masters, and their purpose, something darker began to stir in the shadows of the new modern nation. The Meiji Restoration of the late 19th century was meant to bring progress, but it also created a void, a generation of men stripped of status, bound by old codes of honor that no longer fit the polished world of railroads and Western suits. From that vacuum emerged the first whispers of what the world would later fear and mythologize as the Yakuza. The story does not begin with violence, but with exclusion. Japan's new capitalist society had no place for the gamblers, peddlers, and drifters who had once served feudal lords. These outcasts formed their own brotherhoods. The tekiya, street merchants who roamed from town to town, selling everything from amulets to contraband, and the bakuto, gamblers who ran illegal dens where dice rolled like the fate of a fallen empire. Together, these groups forged an identity built on survival, loyalty, and defiance. Their ranks were filled with the poor, the desperate, and the dishonored, men who found in the underworld a new kind of family, a surrogate feudal clan, where obedience, loyalty, and revenge replaced the lost ideals of Bushido. The Yakuza, as they would later be called, drew their name from the losing hand in a card game, Yakuza, or 893, a worthless combination. They were, by definition, society's losers, and yet they carried themselves with the pride of warriors. Their tattoos, elaborate full-body works of art depicting dragons, tigers, and waves, became their armor. Their rituals, including the infamous yubitsume, the severing of a finger to atone for failure, were their code. Each cut was a reminder that even in dishonor, loyalty must remain absolute. To betray the group was to betray one's own blood. In the rubble-strewn aftermath of World War II, Japan was a land of chaos. Cities lay in ruins, black markets thrived, and the people starved. It was here, amid the hunger and desperation, that the Yakuza truly came into power. While the Allied occupation forces attempted to rebuild democracy, the Yakuza rebuilt control. They distributed food, managed prostitution rings for soldiers, and offered protection in the lawless streets. To the starving Japanese, they were both predators and providers. A strange moral code governed their acts, one that mixed compassion with cruelty. "We do what the police cannot," one Yakuza boss famously declared in the 1940s, "and what the politicians will not." By the 1950s, as Japan rose from the ashes into its economic miracle, the Yakuza followed the money. They infiltrated construction companies, labor unions, and entertainment industries. Their structure evolved into something eerily corporate, complete with hierarchies, initiation rituals, and even public offices. Bosses, known as Oyabun, acted like patriarchs, while their subordinates, Kobun, swore oaths of filial loyalty. This father-son bond became the emotional core of the organization. The Yakuza were no longer just criminals. They were a system, a shadow institution that mirrored the very order Japan had tried to build. Yet beneath the facade of honor lay corruption and blood. The post-war Yakuza saw violence as both business and art. Turf wars erupted between rival clans like the Yamaguchi-gumi, Sumiyoshi-kai, and Inagawa-kai. Bodies floated in Tokyo's rivers, but for every bullet fired, there was also a handshake with a politician, a secret donation to a construction tycoon, a bribe that bought silence. In Japan's modern mythos, the Yakuza were both villains and protectors, symbols of rebellion in a nation obsessed with conformity. But to understand the Yakuza's later entanglement with the United States, one must understand their cultural duality. They were, at their core, not mere gangsters, but men who believed they were preserving a lost way of life. Their ceremonies borrowed from the samurai code, the sharing of sake to seal oaths, the reverence for hierarchy, the notion of personal sacrifice for collective honor. In their underground gatherings, ancient Japanese values coexisted with modern criminality. It was as if the ghosts of the samurai had traded armor for tattoos, swords for pistols, and loyalty to a lord for loyalty to the syndicate. American occupation also changed everything. When US soldiers flooded into Japan, they brought not only money and influence, but also opportunity. The black markets of Tokyo and Osaka were soon filled with American cigarettes, whiskey, and weapons. The Yakuza saw this as their gateway to international trade. They began to learn the language of Western commerce, dealing in imported goods, stolen army supplies, and later drugs. As Japan modernized, so did they, swapping gambling dens for corporate offices and backroom deals for front companies that appeared entirely legitimate. The Yakuza also began cultivating an image that would travel across the Pacific, one of mystique and danger. Hollywood would later romanticize them in films like Black Rain and The Yakuza, but the truth was far more complex. Beneath the cinematic sheen of loyalty and honor was a brutal reality. Beatings, extortion, and murder disguised as discipline. The Yakuza's own sense of justice was absolute, swift, merciless, and unflinching. To cross them meant exile or death. To serve them meant protection, power, and belonging. By the 1970s, the Yakuza had become an empire hidden in plain sight. They were billion-dollar syndicates dressed in suits, mingling with Japan's business elite and whispering into the ears of politicians. Their reach extended into the banking system, the stock exchange, and eventually across oceans. The United States, with its open markets and multicultural cities, became their next frontier. But that part of the story, the quiet invasion that began through legitimate business and cultural ties, was still a few years away. For now, Japan's underworld had been born, its code written in blood and honor, its members baptized in both shame and pride. The Yakuza's rise was not just a tale of crime, it was a reflection of Japan itself, a mirror of its contradictions, its beauty and its darkness. In the neon glow of post-war Tokyo, men who had once been nothing became gods of the underworld, their tattoos glowing beneath the lights like maps of a forbidden empire. And though the world would come to see them as monsters, in their own minds, they were keepers of balance, heirs to an ancient order in a modern world that had forgotten the meaning of loyalty. Their story was only beginning. Soon, that code, forged in the ashes of samurai honor, would travel across the ocean, seeking new territories, new alliances, and new forms of power. America would open its doors, unknowingly welcoming not just investors and businessmen from Japan, but emissaries of a shadow empire. The 1980s were the years when Japan dazzled the world. Neon lights illuminated Tokyo's skyline, real estate prices reached the heavens, and Japanese corporations seemed unstoppable. Beneath that economic miracle, however, another empire was flourishing, one built not on innovation, but on intimidation. The Yakuza, whose roots once tangled in the dusty backstreets of gambling dens and fish markets, were now wearing tailored suits and speaking the language of global finance. Their code had not changed, but their battlefield had. They were no longer fighting for territory in Osaka's alleys. They were moving money through banks in Los Angeles, Geneva, and Hong Kong. In this new world, the Yakuza discovered the ultimate weapon: legitimacy. Japan's booming economy provided the perfect cover. Construction projects, real estate investments, entertainment conglomerates all became tools for laundering dirty money. The government, hungry for progress, often turned a blind eye. A Yakuza boss could dine with a politician at noon and sign a corporate deal by nightfall. They owned talent agencies, nightclubs, and even publishing houses, controlling the very image of Japanese success. In the shadows of skyscrapers, power brokers and criminals drank from the same bottle of sake, each pretending not to see the other's reflection. The shift from blades to balance sheets did not mean the Yakuza had abandoned their brutality. Instead, violence became a language of persuasion, used sparingly but effectively. In the late 1970s, the Yamaguchi-gumi, Japan's largest syndicate, began consolidating smaller groups under a corporate-like structure, with regional subsidiaries and strategic alliances. Rivalries were settled through mergers instead of massacres. But when negotiation failed, streets still ran red. Beneath the polished veneer of order, the underworld seethed with silent wars, assassinations disguised as car accidents, disappearances justified as business losses. Globalization became their stage. As Japanese corporations expanded overseas, the Yakuza followed, quietly, methodically. They invested in Hawaii's tourism boom, bought hotels in Los Angeles, and opened import-export fronts in California. They mingled with Japanese businessmen abroad, often becoming silent partners in legitimate ventures. Money flowed both ways. Drug profits from Southeast Asia and illegal gambling revenues from Japan were laundered through U.S. real estate and art deals. By the mid-1980s, FBI and Interpol reports began whispering the same phrase, Yakuza presence, but proving it was almost impossible. These men didn't carry guns in the streets of San Francisco. They carried briefcases and passports stamped with business visas. The Yakuza's influence was not limited to crime. It seeped into diplomacy and finance. Japan's rise as an economic superpower created a kind of immunity for its businessmen, and the Yakuza exploited that diplomatic shield. They forged connections with bankers in Switzerland, tycoons in Hong Kong, and even members of political families in Washington. Wherever Japan invested, the Yakuza's shadow followed, hiding in the margins of prosperity. They had learned the Western game. If you can't conquer a country with fear, you buy it with money. By the late 1980s, one man symbolized this transformation. Kazuo Taoka, the legendary boss of the Yamaguchi-gumi. Known as the Godfather of Japan, Taoka understood that crime could thrive better under the illusion of order. He expanded the syndicate's reach through careful diplomacy, forming quiet partnerships with American and European organized crime families. His vision was simple: globalization without borders, loyalty without limits. Through him, the Yakuza began investing in casinos, luxury imports, and international shipping. Behind every deal, there was always a hidden layer: drug smuggling disguised as trade, human trafficking masked as tourism, and extortion buried beneath the legal paperwork of multinational contracts. Yet the Yakuza's rise on the global stage also attracted unwanted attention. American intelligence agencies, still haunted by Cold War paranoia, began tracking the flow of Japanese capital into U.S. cities. Investigations revealed strange overlaps between corporate entities and individuals with criminal records in Japan. One of the first major crackdowns came in Honolulu, where FBI operations uncovered Yakuza investments in hotels and nightclubs that served as fronts for money laundering and narcotics distribution. In Los Angeles, detectives started noticing Japanese businessmen appearing in meetings with known mafia figures. What connected them was not ethnicity, but enterprise, the shared goal of turning crime into commerce. What made the Yakuza different from other syndicates was their cultural armor. They did not see themselves as criminals in the Western sense. They saw themselves as men of Ninkyo, the chivalrous path. Even in global dealings, they adhered to ritual and formality. Business meetings began with the ceremonial sharing of sake. Contracts were bound by personal honor, not legal documentation. And when deals went wrong, resolution came not in courtrooms, but through quiet acts of vengeance. The Yakuza's ancient ethics survived the digital age, giving them a mystique that both fascinated and terrified their Western counterparts. In the United States, the Yakuza found not just profit, but validation. To be successful in America meant recognition, and recognition meant legitimacy. They began courting politicians, sponsoring cultural events, and donating to Japanese-American foundations. At the surface, they were ambassadors of Japanese industry. Beneath it, they were architects of a vast criminal economy. Even the FBI admitted in confidential reports that the Yakuza does not invade, it integrates. That integration made them far more dangerous than any street gang or drug cartel. The 1990s would eventually bring decline. Japan's economic bubble burst, and with it, many of the Yakuza's financial empires collapsed. But the seeds they planted abroad would continue to grow. Their businesses in California, Hawaii, and New York provided blueprints for transnational operations that later influenced triads, Russian syndicates, and Latin American cartels. The Yakuza had shown the world a new model of organized crime, one that wore a suit instead of a mask and used financial instruments instead of weapons. In truth, the Yakuza's global expansion was less an invasion and more an infection. It spread silently, through contracts, investments, and alliances, adapting to each culture it touched. By the time American law enforcement understood the depth of their reach, it was already too late. Yakuza money had flowed into US casinos, real estate developments, and even entertainment companies. Their influence was invisible, their power dispersed. What began as a brotherhood of outcasts had become an international network, disciplined, calculating, and unstoppable. And yet, beneath the skyscrapers and the business suits, their hearts still beat to the rhythm of the old code. They still saw themselves as warriors, protectors of their clan, avengers of dishonor, heirs of an ancient loyalty. The modern world had changed their tools, but not their souls. Their next chapter would take them across the Pacific, to American soil itself, where their quiet invasion would begin, not with violence, but with investment. The Pacific Ocean once seemed like an impenetrable barrier between the underworlds of Japan and the United States. Yet by the late 1970s, that ocean had become a bridge, an invisible corridor through which Japan's most secretive syndicate quietly entered American soil. Their gateway was not Los Angeles or New York, but the lush, deceptive paradise of Hawaii. To tourists, it was a postcard dream. Beaches, hula dancers, and sun-kissed waves. But to the Yakuza, Honolulu was something else entirely. A strategic frontier between East and West, a place where the codes of the old world could merge with the opportunities of the new. It began innocently enough. Japanese investors poured billions into Hawaii's tourism boom. They bought hotels, restaurants, and real estate. The islands were a playground for wealthy businessmen and politicians who wanted to enjoy luxury while maintaining discretion. But among those businessmen were men whose hands bore the faint scars of yubitsume, whose tattoos hid beneath crisp suits, whose smiles concealed oaths sworn in blood. They were emissaries of the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Sumiyoshi-kai, and the Inagawa-kai, Japan's three most powerful syndicates. Their mission was simple: establish a foothold in America without ever firing a bullet. Honolulu's nightclubs became the first contact points. In the shadows of Waikiki, Yakuza members opened bars and entertainment venues that catered to both Japanese tourists and local elites. Money flowed like sake, and with it came drugs, gambling, and prostitution. American GIs stationed in the Pacific became regulars, oblivious to who was really running the show. To the authorities, these establishments were just another piece of the city's nightlife. To the Yakuza, they were laboratories, testing grounds for expansion, proving that crime could operate undetected under the mask of culture and hospitality. One FBI report from the early 1980s described the Yakuza's presence in Honolulu as sophisticated, invisible, and deeply rooted. Investigators noticed a peculiar pattern. A chain of Japanese-owned real estate companies registered under fake names, all funneling money to the same offshore accounts in Tokyo. When agents traced those accounts, they found connections to known Yamaguchi-gumi affiliates, but proving a crime was nearly impossible. Every document was legal, every signature immaculate. The Yakuza had mastered the art of blending legality with corruption, turning bureaucracy into their strongest weapon. Behind this expansion was a man known in Japan as the banker of the underworld, Yoshio Kodama. Though not a Yakuza boss in the traditional sense, Kodama had deep ties to organized crime and Japan's political elite. During the 1960s and 70s, he helped broker deals between corporations, intelligence agencies, and the underworld, acting as a middleman between power and profit. When Japanese capital began flooding into Hawaii, Kodama's network ensured that part of that money served dual purposes: legitimate investment and criminal enterprise. He once said, "In Japan, the line between honor and corruption is not drawn in law, but in loyalty." His philosophy became the Yakuza's guiding principle in America. By the mid-1980s, Honolulu had become the Yakuza's bridgehead. Their reach extended beyond the islands, to California, where they forged alliances with local gangs and Asian syndicates. They found natural partners in the triads of Hong Kong and the Korean-Chinese gangs that controlled Los Angeles Koreatown. Together, they created smuggling routes for methamphetamine, heroin, and weapons, all masked behind legitimate import-export businesses. Cargo ships that arrived from Tokyo's Yokohama port carried not just electronics and cars, but sometimes human cargo, trafficked women and enforcers sent to expand operations. For American law enforcement, this was uncharted territory. They had studied the Italian mafia, infiltrated the Colombian cartels, and mapped the networks of the triads, but the Yakuza were something different. They were disciplined, secretive, and fiercely loyal. They avoided unnecessary violence, preferring financial domination to street wars. They bribed officials, invested in real estate, and cultivated relationships with local politicians. The FBI called them ghost businessmen, men who operated in broad daylight but left no trace at night. Honolulu became their sanctuary. Yakuza leaders vacationed there, holding quiet meetings in luxury hotel suites overlooking Diamond Head. They hosted lavish dinners where Japanese executives, American financiers, and criminal intermediaries dined together under the soft glow of candlelight. Deals were sealed with smiles and sake, not blood. One former U.S. intelligence officer later described it as organized crime without the gunpowder. But behind the elegance lay a darker truth. Every investment, every handshake, every toast was part of a larger web designed to extend Japan's underworld influence across the Pacific. In one notable case, an FBI sting operation uncovered Yakuza involvement in a Honolulu real estate syndicate that laundered over $50 million in illegal profits. The group used shell corporations to buy luxury condos, selling them back and forth to inflate values and clean the money. When agents finally moved in, they found ledgers filled with coded Japanese writing and a photo of a Tokyo boss pinned discreetly inside a drawer. But most of the suspects walked free. The U.S. legal system was ill-equipped to handle foreign syndicates whose crimes were both international and camouflaged as commerce. Culturally, the Yakuza fit Hawaii like a glove. The island's deep Japanese-American community offered both cover and connection. Local businessmen respected their formality, politicians welcomed their money, and unlike mainland gangs, the Yakuza understood subtlety. They never sought dominance through fear, but through integration. They built trust, sponsored festivals, and donated to temples. For many, they were seen not as criminals, but as successful expatriates investing in their heritage. The irony was chilling. America had unknowingly opened its doors to an ancient criminal order cloaked in respectability. As the decade closed, whispers of their influence reached Washington. A Senate subcommittee began investigating Asian organized crime in the early 1990s, revealing shocking links between Yakuza financiers, American banks, and corrupt brokers. One senator described it best: they didn't invade America, they bought it, one beachfront property at a time. By then, the Yakuza's bridge across the Pacific was complete. The syndicate had successfully merged the traditions of the East with the capitalism of the West, creating a criminal hybrid that operated beyond borders. Yet even as they flourished, cracks began to appear. The fall of Japan's economic bubble in the early 1990s weakened their financial backbone. Law enforcement pressure in both Japan and the US intensified. Some bosses were arrested, others disappeared. But the network they had built, the Honolulu connection, remained intact, passing quietly into the hands of new generations who would adapt it for the age of cybercrime and global finance. The Pacific Bridge had done its work. What began with gamblers and peddlers centuries ago had now evolved into a multinational shadow enterprise stretching from Tokyo's back streets to American boardrooms. And while tourists still watched the sunset on Waikiki Beach, unaware of the silent empire built beneath their feet, the Yakuza continued to operate, patient, methodical, and eternal, waiting for the next wave of opportunity to carry them further into the heart of America. By the late 1980s, Los Angeles was more than just the city of dreams. It was a kingdom built on illusion. Beneath the shimmering lights of Hollywood, a quieter, far more dangerous reality pulsed beneath the surface. It was here, amid the glitz of red carpets and the whir of cameras, that the Yakuza found a new frontier. They didn't arrive with guns drawn or tattoos exposed. They came in tailored Armani suits, carrying briefcases, investment portfolios, and an unnerving sense of patience. For the first time in history, the Japanese underworld had entered America's cultural capital, not through violence, but through money. The 1980s were a decade obsessed with power and wealth. Japanese corporations were buying American landmarks, Pebble Beach, Rockefeller Center, even Hollywood studios. To the public, it looked like economic cooperation between allies. To the FBI, it looked like something else. An open door through which Japan's organized crime could move billions of yen without scrutiny. The Yakuza's American operations were no longer confined to the islands of Hawaii or the docks of San Francisco. Los Angeles was where they wanted to make their mark, because Los Angeles was where image ruled everything, and image was something they had mastered for centuries. At the heart of this expansion was a quiet collaboration between Yakuza financiers and American businessmen desperate for Japanese capital. Japan's economy was booming, and Hollywood, perpetually in need of money, welcomed investors with open arms. The Yakuza exploited this hunger. Through front companies in Tokyo and Osaka, they began funding small film production firms, distribution companies, and entertainment agencies. Some of these were genuine investments. Others were elaborate laundering schemes designed to clean money from drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and prostitution networks back home. The glamour of Hollywood was the perfect disguise. The FBI would later describe this period as the invisible infiltration. Agents assigned to the Pacific Organized Crime Task Force noticed that certain Japanese investors in Los Angeles had unexplained connections to figures known to Japanese law enforcement. They bought nightclubs in West Hollywood, partnered with record labels, and financed film projects that mysteriously lost money but continued operating. The funds moved through complex webs of shell corporations, bouncing from Tokyo to Hong Kong to the Cayman Islands, before arriving in Los Angeles banks. The paper trail was perfect. The crime, as always, was hidden behind paperwork. But what fascinated investigators most wasn't the money. It was the access. The Yakuza understood something fundamental about America. If you controlled the image, you controlled the narrative. They began frequenting exclusive Hollywood parties, mingling with producers, actors, and politicians. There were stories, whispered, never proven, of Yakuza bosses attending Oscar parties, arriving in black limousines, their bodyguards waiting outside in silence. Their money bought influence, and influence opened doors. Some producers claimed they didn't know where the funds came from. Others didn't care. In an industry built on fiction, truth had become negotiable. Among the syndicates, the Yamaguchi-gumi led the charge. They used connections built through legitimate Japanese corporations that already had ties in California's entertainment and real estate industries. They partnered with American criminal networks, the remnants of the Italian mafia, the Russian mob, and certain arms of the Colombian cartels. Together they created a triangle of power: drugs from South America, distribution through Los Angeles, and laundering through Japanese investment. The result was a seamless flow of money and goods: cocaine shipped under false manifests, art pieces sold at inflated prices, and film deals structured to lose profit publicly while enriching their backers privately. In one case, uncovered by US Customs, a Yakuza-connected import company was found to be shipping props for a Hollywood movie. Inside the crates were military-grade firearms. The scandal was hushed before it reached the headlines, but for federal agents, it was confirmation that the line between art and crime had blurred beyond recognition. The same syndicates funding films about violence were arming the streets that inspired them. There was also a more symbolic reason for their interest in Hollywood. The Yakuza had long understood the power of mythology. In Japan, they cultivated their own legend: men of honor, protectors of the weak, bound by an ancient code. Now Hollywood gave them a global stage to rewrite their image. Films like Black Rain and the Yakuza romanticized them as mysterious anti-heroes, disciplined and loyal. The irony was that some of those productions were financed indirectly by the very men being portrayed. The syndicate had turned propaganda into business, controlling how the West perceived them while using that perception to further their real operations. Behind the curtains, alliances deepened. A few American studios, unaware or willfully blind, continued taking investment from Yakuza-affiliated companies. Wealthy Japanese executives with ties to organized crime appeared as silent partners in luxury hotel projects and entertainment ventures. They sponsored charity events, bought art galleries, and cultivated relationships with Hollywood agents and financiers. Their influence extended to Las Vegas as well, where Yakuza money helped fund casino developments and gambling equipment manufacturing. The connection between Hollywood and Vegas, glamour and vice, was exactly where the Yakuza thrived. FBI Special Agent Ronald Bell, in a 1992 interview, described it succinctly: "They didn't conquer Los Angeles with violence, they seduced it with money." The Yakuza's American presence wasn't marked by bloodshed, but by elegance. They built relationships instead of empires, partnerships instead of wars. It was organized crime redefined for the modern age, cleaner, quieter, but just as deadly in its consequences. By the early 1990s, federal investigations intensified. The FBI, IRS, and DEA began coordinating to track the flow of Japanese money into American entertainment and real estate. What they found was staggering: millions of dollars connected to shell companies linked to known syndicates. Some of these companies owned Hollywood studios outright. Others held controlling shares in American luxury brands. Yet very few arrests were made. The Yakuza had mastered what American law struggled to define: transnational economic crime without direct violence. They were not invaders, they were investors. As the Japanese economy began to falter in the mid-1990s, the Yakuza's Hollywood presence started to fade. Some front companies went bankrupt. Others were quietly absorbed by legitimate businesses. But the traces remained: silent signatures in the contracts, untraceable funds that had already been cleaned and reintroduced into the global economy. By the time the authorities closed in, the Yakuza had already evolved again, moving their interests towards cybercrime, online gambling, and financial fraud. Still, the legend of their Hollywood chapter lingers, a strange collision between glamour and corruption, between fiction and fact. In the very heart of America's dream factory, Japan's most secretive criminal empire had found its stage. They had played their roles perfectly, investors, producers, patrons of art, and when the curtain fell, they left the scene untouched, their faces unknown, their legacy hidden beneath the same bright lights that had once blinded everyone around them. By the dawn of the 1990s, the quiet infiltration was complete. The Yakuza no longer needed to sneak into the United States. They were already here, embedded in its cities, its industries, and even its criminal underworld. From the ports of Los Angeles to the alleys of Seattle, the Japanese syndicates had forged an invisible network. But expansion comes with territory, and territory in America was never given. It was taken. The Yakuza soon found themselves face to face with the men who already ruled those streets: American gangs, drug cartels, and outlaw biker clubs that were just as ruthless, just as territorial, and far less predictable. At first, the encounters were cautious. The Yakuza had no interest in starting a war on foreign soil. Their code valued discipline over chaos, and their business depended on discretion. In Los Angeles, they approached the situation the way they always had. Through alliances, not invasions. Through their legitimate import-export companies, they met with triads from Hong Kong, Korean-Chinese syndicates, and the Mexican cartels that controlled narcotics routes across the southern border. Each group had something the Yakuza wanted. The triads had connections to heroin production in Southeast Asia. The Koreans had smuggling routes across the Pacific. The cartels had the distribution networks in America. The Yakuza brought something all of them lacked: organization, discipline, and access to international finance. In the backrooms of Koreatown restaurants and Marina del Rey offices, deals were struck in silence. Japanese businessmen met with tattooed gang leaders under the guise of cultural exchange or trade agreements. The FBI, overwhelmed by the diversity of organized crime in Los Angeles, struggled to keep up. Their files began to show an unusual pattern: Yakuza names appearing alongside those of the Mexican Mafia, the Crips, the Hells Angels, and even Russian mobsters. What had once been separate empires were now beginning to merge through mutual profit. The Yakuza's interest was not in street-level crime. They viewed the American gangs as foot soldiers, not equals. The Japanese syndicates needed them for muscle, for access to drugs and weapons, and for the dirty work that could not be traced back to their polished corporate fronts. In exchange, they offered the gangs something rare: money, protection, and legitimacy. Some gang leaders began laundering their drug profits through Japanese-owned real estate firms in Los Angeles and San Diego. Others used Yakuza-run casinos in Hawaii and Saipan to clean their earnings. The alliance was mutually beneficial until greed and pride began to unravel it. One of the earliest conflicts erupted in Seattle, where Yakuza operatives had partnered with a local biker gang to smuggle methamphetamine from Japan into the United States. The partnership began smoothly, but soon disputes over profit and distribution led to violence. In 1991, 3 bodies were found near Tacoma, their fingers severed, a signature Yakuza warning. Local authorities dismissed it as a gang feud, unaware that it marked one of the first known instances of Yakuza enforcement on American soil. It sent a message: the code of Japan's underworld would be respected, even here. Yet for every alliance that ended in blood, others thrived. The Yakuza developed a particularly effective relationship with the triads of Hong Kong. Together, they operated a vast drug and counterfeit network, smuggling narcotics, weapons, and fake luxury goods through the ports of Long Beach and Oakland. The shipments arrived hidden inside containers of electronics, cars, and furniture. U.S. Customs often missed them, The paperwork was immaculate, the companies appeared legitimate, and the cargo moved too quickly to track. It was globalization's dark mirror, international trade repurposed for organized crime. But perhaps the most curious partnership of all was with the Mexican cartels. In the early 1990s, as cocaine and meth flooded the American market, the Yakuza saw an opportunity. They supplied precursor chemicals from Asia, shipped through Japan's industrial ports, and the cartels handled manufacturing and distribution. The profits were astronomical. Meetings between cartel emissaries and Yakuza representatives were reported in Honolulu, Los Angeles, and even Mexico City. It was a perfect exchange, Japan's precision meeting Mexico's brutality, and for a while it worked. Still, the Yakuza underestimated one thing: the unpredictability of American crime. Street gangs did not follow codes of honor. Their loyalty could be bought or broken overnight. The Japanese model, built on hierarchy, discipline, and silence, collided with the chaotic, impulsive violence of American culture. While Yakuza enforcers prided themselves on clean efficiency, their American partners sought spectacle. Drive-by shootings, kidnappings, and flamboyant displays of wealth drew attention, something the Yakuza despised. The more they tried to maintain order, the more control they lost. The FBI began to take notice. Operation Sunset, a joint investigation between the FBI and DEA in the early 1990s, revealed connections between Yakuza fronts and American drug rings operating in Los Angeles and Chicago. Wiretaps captured conversations in multiple languages: English, Japanese, Cantonese, and Spanish, all discussing shipments, profits, and bribes. For the first time, U.S. intelligence began to understand that what they were facing was not just a single organization, but a syndicate of syndicates, a global web of criminal cooperation that transcended culture and nationality. Violence, however, could not be avoided forever. As profits grew, rivalries hardened. The Yakuza's alliances with the triads began to fracture over control of shipping lanes in the Pacific. A series of mysterious disappearances followed: smugglers, middlemen, and even corporate accountants who knew too much. Some were found washed ashore in California, others vanished without a trace. The press never connected the dots, but those inside the underworld understood. The Yakuza were cleaning house. Even as they fought, the Yakuza adapted. They replaced human intermediaries with technology, using encrypted communications, offshore accounts, and corporate facades. By the mid-1990s, their relationships with American gangs had evolved into something more detached, less brotherhood, more business. They no longer needed to meet in person. Money and goods moved through digital systems and global supply chains. The face-to-face diplomacy of the old underworld was giving way to the faceless empire of the new. Yet beneath the shifting strategies, one truth remained constant. The Yakuza had succeeded in embedding themselves within the ecosystem of American crime. They had learned to blend loyalty with pragmatism, to partner when necessary and destroy when challenged. Their influence was no longer measured by territory, but by connectivity. The number of ports they controlled, the bank accounts they manipulated, the politicians they could influence. By the time the century turned, their alliances had transformed into something almost invisible. The gangs they once met in back alleys now worked unknowingly for their enterprises. The cartels they partnered with still used Yakuza-controlled chemical suppliers. The bikers and triads continued to move shipments that originated from their networks. The blood ties had become financial threads, woven so tightly into the fabric of global crime that even cutting one would barely make a difference. The hidden wars had left their scars in the streets, in the shadows, and in the quiet offices of men who would never admit their connections. But for the Yakuza, America had become exactly what they had envisioned: a vast, lucrative chessboard. They no longer needed to fight for control. They already owned the game. By the beginning of the 21st century, The Yakuza were no longer the tattooed warriors of alleyway battles or the suited investors of Hollywood boardrooms. They had become something else, something quieter, more pervasive, and infinitely harder to detect. The new Yakuza didn't carry guns or blades. They carried passwords, stock portfolios, and offshore accounts. Their battleground was no longer the neon streets of Tokyo or the beaches of Honolulu. It was the invisible world of global finance, politics, and technology. Japan's economic collapse in the 1990s, the so-called lost decade, should have destroyed them. Banks failed, real estate values plummeted, and the empire they had built on inflated investments began to crumble. Yet the Yakuza, like the tide, always adapted. They withdrew from the public eye, abandoned their flamboyant displays of wealth, and restructured their operations into smaller, leaner cells. The new generation of bosses understood what the old ones had not, that power in the modern world did not come from control over streets, but from control over systems. By the early 2000s, the Yakuza had embraced technology with the same precision that had once defined their rituals. They became investors in the digital frontier, funneling money into cryptocurrency ventures, online gambling, and international banking. Through proxies and shell companies, they moved billions in digital assets across continents without a trace. Bitcoin, offshore exchanges, and encrypted transfers became their new weapons. A U.S. Treasury report in 2018 described the Yakuza as a hybrid of tradition and innovation, a criminal network built on honor but operating in algorithms. But finance was only one part of the web. The Yakuza also learned to manipulate politics, both in Japan and abroad. In Tokyo, their influence stretched quietly into the corridors of power. For decades, they had cultivated relationships with politicians, offering campaign funds and silent favors in exchange for protection. That system evolved. Now they used lobbying firms, investment groups, and anonymous donations to maintain their reach. A retired Japanese police commissioner once said, "The Yakuza doesn't bribe politicians anymore. They own the companies that donate to them." In the United States, their political footprint was subtler but no less significant. Through real estate conglomerates and consulting firms, Yakuza-affiliated investors began participating in American campaigns, think tanks, and lobbying circles. Their names never appeared directly. They hid behind layers of corporate veils, yet the influence was there, in the funding of cultural exchange programs, art foundations, and even technological startups with dual-use capabilities. Intelligence reports suggested that some Yakuza-connected companies had contracts supplying parts for both civilian and military technology exports. Whether by design or coincidence, the lines between commerce, espionage, and organized crime had vanished. The FBI, which had once hunted Yakuza gunmen and smugglers, now found itself chasing data. Their investigations shifted from drug busts to financial forensics, tracing suspicious capital flows from Tokyo to Los Angeles, from Singapore to Zurich. Yet every lead dissolved into another offshore shell, another anonymous cryptocurrency wallet. The syndicate had learned from the mistakes of the past. Never appear, never leave a signature, and never act directly when you can act through others. While their financial sophistication grew, the Yakuza never abandoned their roots entirely. The rituals, the loyalty oaths, the sense of belonging, these traditions continued behind closed doors, but their meaning had changed. The younger members were not street soldiers, but programmers, accountants, and brokers. Their tattoos were hidden under white shirts, their swords replaced by smartphones. Some called them the digital samurai, an ironic nod to the code that had survived centuries: loyalty, honor, and silence, now translated into the modern age. Despite their invisibility, traces of their influence still surfaced in the real world. In 2011, after Japan's catastrophic earthquake and Fukushima disaster, Yakuza groups were among the first to deliver aid to the affected areas. Trucks loaded with supplies arrived before the government's own convoys. To the public, it was an act of compassion. To experts, it was strategy, a reminder that the syndicate still saw itself as part of the nation's moral backbone. Even in America, similar gestures appeared in Japanese-American communities, where anonymous donations funded recovery programs and cultural institutions. The benefactors were never named, but investigators recognized the pattern, the Yakuza's unique blend of benevolence and control. The digital age also brought new enemies. Cybercrime syndicates in Eastern Europe and Russia began competing for dominance in the same financial networks the Yakuza had built. Instead of fighting them physically, the Yakuza chose collaboration. Quiet partnerships emerged between Japanese syndicates and Russian hackers, the same type of pragmatic alliances they had once formed with cartels and triads decades earlier. Together they laundered money through cryptocurrencies, manipulated markets, and even targeted corporations for extortion. It was organized crime, without borders, without faces, without fingerprints. Yet the greatest danger of all lay not in their crimes, but in their normalization. As decades passed, the Yakuza ceased to be perceived as an external threat. In Japan, their organizations registered official offices, filed taxes, and even held public press conferences. In America, their presence was buried under the anonymity of global capitalism. Their companies employed thousands, their funds financed legitimate projects, and their influence bled into every sector where power and money converged. The modern Yakuza had achieved what their predecessors could only dream of: invisibility through respectability. Culturally, they became mythic. Films, novels, and documentaries turned them into archetypes, the dark mirror of Japan's discipline and precision. Western fascination with their mystique only strengthened their legend. But behind the romance lay the truth. The Yakuza were not vanishing. They were evolving. Their tattoos had faded from sight, but their fingerprints were now embedded in the digital and political architecture of nations. They no longer needed fear to rule. They ruled through presence, unseen but undeniable. Today, their web extends quietly across continents, from Tokyo to Los Angeles, from London to Singapore. Their empire is not measured in bodies or bullets, but in influence and integration. They sit on boards of companies, influence trade routes, and manipulate currencies. And when governments boast of progress in fighting organized crime, the Yakuza simply smile. Because the war was never fought on the streets, it was fought in systems, in data, in trust. Perhaps that is their greatest triumph. They have become indistinguishable from the world they inhabit. The code of the samurai has survived not by resisting modernization, but by mastering it. The Yakuza no longer bow before emperors or fight for territories. They move silently through the circuitry of the modern world, an invisible empire woven into the fabric of global civilization. In the end, the Yakuza's story is not just a chronicle of crime, but a parable of adaptation. From the gamblers and peddlers of the Edo period to the crypto-financiers and lobbyists of today, their evolution mirrors humanity's own. Ever-changing, ever-striving for power, cloaked always in the illusion of honor. The question that remains is chillingly simple. If the Yakuza can evolve beyond crime to become part of the system itself, then where, in this modern world, does corruption truly end and civilization